Good afternoon. This is Dr. Craig Stern of Pharma Pharmaceutical Consultants and ProData Analytics. I'm delighted to have a few minutes to talk to you today. I want to talk about values. There's obviously been a lot of discussion about general values, constitutional values, how people talk to each other. And that's mostly a political argument. But one of the arguments that's been brought up about health plans, about insurance, about the Affordable Care Act, etc., has to deal with whether it's issues where insurance companies are taking advantage, or whether there's issues with regard to people not making enough money, etc. But in fact, in general in managed care, there are some values. They're not codified to my knowledge. There's never been a book or otherwise that's codified it. But I do want to talk about some values. So let me address that. And while this is a topic that I frequently use when I'm speaking with interns and students and medical residents, I would like to talk about values here for a moment. There's approximately four major ones. There's a whole bunch of others, and as I say, I'd like to say that there was something legal about it. There isn't, but they are values, and I think there's things we should address. The first is that benefits in general are covered under Title I of the Social Security Act. As a result of that, benefits are subject to the Constitution of the United States and the protections that are identified in the Bill of Rights. And so in general, there are issues that have to deal with bias, and that you cannot show bias against people based on gender, based on religion, etc., and culture, of course. And so, when we're dealing with that, that seems to be fundamental and something that is generally accepted and something that we can all understand. It has led to to some arguments that have occurred over the past few years, where I believe the Catholic Church and Catholic bishops were arguing with the Affordable Care Act and some issues with the president over issues with regard to whether all religions had to follow a similar kind of benefits. But there is an underlying principle here, and that is that in general, a president or anybody in particular cannot just define something that in fact is going to be harmful to any given group. And it's general, it has parity across all groups, and then of course any given group can decide or can make up their own mind and sue or bring up issues with regard that are in conflict with their own religion. And that clearly has issues with regard to abortion and issues with regard to birthing and things like that. The second issue has to deal with with dollars. And since the very inception, since at least 1973, but it was in discussion before that, that money was a defining issue, and that if something was really expensive, then somebody could put some sort of a kibosh on it, and the people couldn't get it because of cost. In fact, there was a decision called the Wickline Decision that didn't have to do with managed care. It had to do with a hospital. But it set a precedence, and that precedence was that in general, the hospital refused to provide a particular procedure, treatment, etc., based on cost. And the arguments were put. It was brought to a legal court, and the issue was that dollars can be used, but that the first things that must be addressed are issues with regard to effectiveness. So if you have more than one option on how to treat or deal with a particular medical problem, that all of them had to be put on the table, presuming that they were all equal or had marginal effectiveness, then cost could become an issue. But it could never be the first issue. And so we were left with the fact that cost can be a factor, but it's not the primary factor and it's not the first factor. It has to be one of the factors that's considered after the effectiveness of particular treatments, the effectiveness of particular surgeries, etc., is weighed. So it's not denying cost, but it is bringing it onto the table and putting it into a particular perspective, and its position not being the primary position. The third value came from a case of a young lady named Nalene Fox. She was a young mother. She had stage 4 breast cancer. And at the time, she and her doctor had requested for her to get a bone marrow transplant. And at the time, bone marrow transplants were not an approved indication for what she specifically was asking, and so the health plan denied it. In fact, the real concern was that Nailin Fox wanted to get it. It was requested, it was denied, and subsequently Nailin Fox passed away, leaving a husband and a couple of young children. Miss Fox's brother was an attorney. He filed suit against the health plan, and in fact he won. And the major issue that was addressed here was not that they wanted a bone marrow transplant, which at the time didn't have a significant amount of information about it. It had a issue with regard to that they weren't consistent, that the health plan in fact had approved this for some other indications, but in fact in a similar situation, but in fact had denied it for Nailin Fox. So the third rule here had to deal with consistency. If you say yes to something, it's yes. If it's no to something, it has to be no, and it has to be consistently no for similar kinds of situations. It can't be sometimes yes, sometimes no. Consistency is a major issue. And so we have so far addressed the fact that benefits in general have to meet the requirements of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and the protections that are included in that. That number two, there has to be an issue with regard to the money, and that money can be a factor, but it can't be the first factor that's addressed. And third had to deal with consistency, and that based on the Nailin Fox decision, that I had to address it. I haven't brought up the health plan because in fairness to everyone, it probably would have been a similar issue for any of the health plans under this at this time. The fourth one is also one that is interesting in that it has been adjudicated by physicians, by nurses, and others over time, but there are other healthcare professionals that have tried to adjudicate this, but are still adjudicating it both in the public mind and in their own professions, including pharmacy. And that is that there's something called the MUD rule, M-U-D-D. Dr. Samuel Mudd was a physician in rural Maryland, and one night a patient came to him with a broken leg. Dr. Mudd, it's controversial as to whether he knew the individual or whether he was aware of what the individual was and what he was there for. But either way, he was a doctor. He treated the patient, fixed the patient's leg, allowed the patient to stay with him, in this particular case in his barn overnight, and then the next morning the patient left. The patient turned out to be John Wilkes Booth, who that evening had just assassinated Abraham Lincoln, the 16th President of the United States. Dr. Mudd subsequently was tried and convicted and went to jail for this and acted as a physician in the jail system. But the issue was that a healthcare provider sees a patient, they have a particular concern, and that concern is treated. This issue has been adjudicated, as I say, by physicians. It's been adjudicated by nursing. Interestingly, it hasn't been adjudicated by pharmacy and some other groups. But at the end of the day, this is a subject that has come up. Pharmacists have filed some court suits, and they, in general, have lost on them. But at the end of the day, we're dealing with an issue of what presents to you is something to treat or something to administer care to, rather than what your own personal beliefs are. So as a general statement, there are rules in this world. They, as I say, they haven't been codified, and so as a result of that, they're not something hanging where everyone has to follow them. But in general, they're general rules, and they are generally accepted as things where people are looking at this and they're saying, these are things that people should generally agree to if they're in the healthcare system. There are things that patients should expect when they come to the healthcare system. And in summary, they have to deal with one, that there isn't a bias that's applied based on the Constitution and the Bill of Rights that's incumbent within the definition of healthcare benefits. That number two, cost is an issue, but it's not the primary issue, and that all options must be placed on the table and decided if they are equal. If they're not equal, then clearly cost cannot be an issue until there is some decision about what is going to be used. But given that they're all equal, then cost can be one of the determining factors. That in general, based on the Nailin Fox case, that there has to be some consistency. And finally, based on the MUD rule, that if the patient presents, then you treat the patient irrespective of religious beliefs, gender beliefs, cultural beliefs, or otherwise. And all of these, interestingly, are still current. They're common. They're things that have been argued over and over many times, and people have looked at them and have said, yes, these are values that we think are important. I think it's important that at least we bring them up, because more often than not, things that we see in the paper, and certainly things that we've seen recently in the paper, have to deal with whether a health plan has a right to do something, whether the Affordable Care Act has a right to do something, or otherwise. But since we're dealing with benefits, we need to seriously consider, what are the values that we look at? How do we go about in a healthcare system deciding how we should act, what kind of values we should hold to, and what are those things that a patient should expect of us? And alternatively, what should a patient expect when they see a healthcare provider? I'm delighted to have a few moments to be able to talk to you. I wish you all well. Please feel free to go to our webpage on www.profarmaconsultants.com/rxinfox.html. That'll give you a chance so that you can look at this and see what's happening on a daily basis, what's the news with regard to manufacturers, analytics, issues with regard to healthcare and pharmacy in general, etc. I think you'll find it of interest. It also gives some stock quotations in the indices so we can see what's happening in overall care. I wish all of you a wonderful week. I'll look forward to talking to you next week. Be well and have a great week. Thank you.